Chapter 2. Tigger's Story. Rupert Sebastian Hamilton Brown, to give him his full name, was a complex soul. His father was ex-guards, minor landed gentry, who inherited the family pile in Herefordshire and managed, by sheer luck, to turn it into one of the best stud farms in the country. His mother, a clever, glamorous Russian model, had decided the best way to permanently leave her native country was to simply marry someone from a different one. She chose Rupert's father, rather than the other way around. Needless to say, it was not a marriage made in heaven, and when Rupert was 6, she had already gotten bored with country life and moved in with an Italian millionaire in Monaco. Rupert was left on his own until he was old enough to be packed off to boarding school. Harrow, of course, where generations of his family had gone by tradition. Not too good if you wanted to go into politics, but otherwise, much to those who recommend it, over some of its more illustrious rivals. At Harrow, back in 1980s Britain, he was teased about his long-winded, double-barreled name, happy to take the nickname Tigger in exchange. He thought later that he would drop the Hamilton too. It sounded so pompous, and many plebs thought it was his Christian name. Well, in the world of plebs, I have to adapt, right? Thought Tigger. So, the Hamilton moniker, as well as that E in Brown, was consigned to history as soon as he turned 18 and could file the paperwork. Not excelling in academic work, Tigger looked forward every day to the afternoon, when he could take to the sports field. It did not matter what sport, anything with a ball, or that involved running. He reckoned he could compete with the best. At 15, he was already in Harrow's first 15 rugby team. As a wing, he could outrun almost any other player, jinking and swerving around most defences. Tigger was also a fearless tackler, and often saved what looked to be a certain try in the final few yards before the touchline. One day was different, though. He noticed a new Nigerian lad playing for the B squad. The B squad was usually cannon fodder for the more elite players in the first 15 who would use them to practice with. Feeling the chilly British autumn rapidly approaching that late September afternoon, Tigger set off and made his move to intercept this adversary, thundering down the touchline, hardly slowing as the large winger deflected one tackle after another. Tigger stormed in to tackle him, but the result was not what he had bargained for, as a flying knee connected with his chin. He woke up in the school sanatorium to find matron leaning over him with some revolting smelling salts. "Bugger that," Tigger thought as he recollected what had happened. Tigger was soon raring to have another crack at his nemesis, Solo, as it turned out the African fellow was called, and luckily, he did not have to wait long. In those days, there was no time out from rugby for head injuries. 2 days later, both teams lined up again, and all eyes were on Solo. Maybe he could make the first team at 14, something that had never been done in the school's long history. Tigger was one of the very few who had made it at 15. That practice match, Tigger earned his reputation as a great tackler. As soon as Solo touched the ball, he took his legs clean out before he managed to work up any turn of speed. Eventually, the two of them, both from worlds apart, developed mutual respect and became great chums. This would be the start of their paths crossing several times in their lives. And trouble was never far behind them as they both headed towards Sandhurst, the illustrious officer training college. Years later, in 2019, Tigger, one quite distinguished career in the military behind him, strolled across Vauxhall Bridge with the Terry Farrell-designed SIS HQ on the embankment ahead of him. The huge building's concrete brutalism did little to endear it, and the interior was almost as austere as its forbidding exterior. Almost Orwellian in his imagination, did that mean he was part of an all-seeing, controlling force? Not exactly, he grinned to himself. the reality did not live up to the expectation. It had been nearly a year since he left the SAS regiment and somehow ended up in the clutches of the MI6, the international branch of Britain's Secret Service. The choice had not been easy, and now he was not sure he had made the right one. All that had been on the table, except for the private security sector, were babysitting roles in the Middle East, but he had not fancied that for all the tea in China. Tigger's last tour of Afghanistan's Helmand province had been a rough one, where the British Army fought a rearguard action as the Taliban took back more and more territory. While the politicos mumbled about tactical warfare, all they wanted now was to pull out, with little dignity remaining. Those wankers never learn from history, Tigger mused, with some justification given the British Army's experiences back in 1841 and 1842. It was one of the most disastrous campaigns it had ever waged. Now, he had been virtually desk-bound for most of the year, with just a weekly practice on the shooting range and unarmed combat training to break up the drudgery of staring at the computer screen and filling out what seemed to be an abundance of redundant reports that he doubted anyone higher up ever read or cared much about. The unarmed combat instructor tried to avoid him whenever he could come up with a good excuse. Tigger took his frustrations out on the unfortunate older man, who started to think about getting a transfer or taking early retirement. That cloudy London morning, Tigger was approaching the security checkpoint when the familiar form of Sergeant Dobson appeared as if summoned by a friendly genie. "Top of the morning to you, Major," Sergeant Dobson said, knowing full well that the use of previous ranks was not encouraged. It was one of Dobson's small pleasures to ignore that and to greet a fellow military man. Tigger half-heartedly saluted back, completing their morning ritual. "And to you, Sergeant," Tigger replied, grinning, as he also enjoyed breaking what he thought of as silly rules whenever he got the chance. Entering the sterile lift, it took him to an even more boring, open-plan office with very little daylight, where he received scarcely any greeting from the motley bunch that made up his co-workers. MI6 was no longer the old public school boys' club it had been when Le Carré wrote about it, capturing a kind of innocence of days gone by. Now it was more a reflection of modern-day Britain, unless you reached the upper echelons. Tigger was about to resign himself to another meaningless day stuck behind his desk in the open-plan paper shufflers area when Harry Fitzpatrick strolled over to his desk. Only very senior denizens of the service like Harry had private offices. For the rest, it was an open-plan existence, with little or no privacy and a sense of dreariness that harked back to how articled clerks rubbed shoulders in Dickens' time. Tigger liked Harry. He was one of the very few people he could relate to in the building. Harry came across as a real toff, but also had that rare streak of decency that allowed him to communicate well with all and sundry, regardless of their age, race, class, or creed, and possibly sexual orientation, despite hailing from a far less tolerant era. Harry had done his best to help Tigger adjust to this strange goldfish bowl type of life. Once they had even gone for a couple of pints across the river at one of the less well-known watering holes. This morning, Harry had a sly grin on his face, as if he was hiding something that might soon be revealed. Noticing this, Tigger began to feel intrigued. "Tigger, come to the briefing room with me. Something has materialized that might tickle your fancy, old boy. A chance for you to put on some mufti again," Harry said as he bestowed a broad smile on his target. "I will be right with you, sir. Should I first find my regimental tie?" Tigger asked. He did not even get a smile back from Harry, who liked to have the last laugh. They took another lift, entering a floor reserved only for private conferences and only accessed with Harry's right eye, unlocking the various lifts and doors. Tigger realized this was the first time he had been admitted to such dizzy heights, and now wished he had worn his pinstripe suit that morning and the famous regimental tie. Never mind. Let's see what fate has in store. Anything, however daft, would be a welcome break to internment on the lower levels of this much overrated edifice, toiling for a secret service whose days of glory are long past was not my best call. Harry swung through the final door, and there sat a man and a woman. Both could be mistaken for middle managers at Marks and Spencer, thought Tigger. Bland, grey, and unremarkable. The woman, with her blonde hair tied back and little or no makeup, did manage a cheery smile and flash of her brilliant green eyes. "Major Brown," Harry said, still grinning, "let me introduce you to our colleagues from 5, our esteemed sister service." He looked at Tigger and added, "I'm going to leave you in their tender care for an hour or so, and see if you are up for their little adventure. Thought it might get you out of my hair for a while and liven things up, dear chap." With no more ado, Harry left, and Tigger took a seat opposite the blonde and her male companion, whom he then addressed, assuming the older man to be the senior. "So, I'm at your service, sir. Anything for Queen and country," Tigger enthusiastically blurted. For the second time in less than 5 minutes, his crude attempt at humour fell flat, and now the older grey man produced a little cough of embarrassment and looked distinctly uncomfortable. "Major Brown," the man said, "please let me introduce MI5's Deputy Director, Miss Stillingfleet. She will be briefing you, and I will try to fill in any gaps from this general briefing later. I will be your main point of contact going forward, and you can call me Rutherford." Miss Stillingfleet's smile became a smirk. She clearly enjoyed these male-orientated assumptions about who was in charge. Then came the second surprise. "We have had a good look at your file and asked 6 about your personality. I'll try to explain why," Miss Stillingfleet said in a slight Irish accent, muted by an expensive private school. She delivered deadpan the mission description, while her piercing green eyes seemed to drill right through Tigger. Their effect was almost more frightening than those mock interrogations the regiment used to put him through from time to time. What she told him was almost too much for anyone to believe. Later, it would connect his past with the present day. It seemed that both MI5 and the CIA, often referred to as the agency, were both very interested in the activities of the London-based Extinction Rebellion, XR for short. To be specific, not so much in this relatively harmless and largely ineffective climate activism group, but some of the shadowy forces and undesirables it was now attracting from around the world. Because of its open structure and lack of hierarchy, there was little overall control within the XR over what went on under their flag. They now had an autonomous agenda, and the ever-present danger was that these affiliates would not always stick to the non-violent protest that XR endorsed. Both MI5 and the agency had been carefully watching the activity of 1 or 2 such affiliates, and it seemed they were not the only spy agencies around the world trying to get in on the act. Yes, some were friendly, like the French, but others, reputed to be from China and Russia, were looking for the opportunity to cause trouble. Tigger thought, this is all a bit rich. What I know about XR is that it seems to be a bunch of old hippies trying to draw attention to global warming. Hard to believe there's a more sinister agenda behind that. But not keen to prejudge, he continued to listen as the bigger picture was outlined. He listened intently as Miss Stillingfleet expanded. The agency was always known for being fast off the mark and was the first to take any real action because the activities of a Nigerian-based XR affiliate were causing ripples for the big oil interests in the notorious Delta area. Calling itself XRN, standing for Extinction Rebellion Nigeria, it tried to hide behind the international XR movement, but was independent and potentially far more belligerent. Funding for XRN was coming from a former Nigerian politician called Peter Amobi, who was based in London and had been granted political asylum some years earlier before anyone figured out that he had fled that country, taking hundreds of millions of siphoned off oil revenues with him. Since then, while the Nigerian government tried their best to extradite him to face justice and recover their money, he and his battery of high-powered lawyers and advisors blocked them at every turn. His payback was to cause trouble there whenever he could, and what better way of causing trouble than disrupting their oil revenues, on which the stability of the whole country depended? In truth, the agency cares little about him or Nigeria, but they did intensely dislike those that troubled big oil, or more precisely, big American oil corporations, which, along with a few multinationals, controlled much of the Delta production and reserves. So the agency selected their undercover agent in London to try to infiltrate the XR and, if possible, XRN as well. Their focus was to get human on Amobi, intelligence gathered from a human source. Then she explained how the agency had passed on the details of Solo in transit to the UK, and MI5 had run him past GCHQ to search and compare multiple databases, which flagged up a connection, drawing a sharp intake of breath from the normally complacent, bespectacled operative. The CIA asset, they referred to as Solo, had been first at the famous public school Harrow and then subsequently Sandhurst, with Major Tigger Brown, who was now languishing, desk-bound, in MI6, a more than useful coincidence. Miss Stillingfleet continued. Since this intelligence operation with the agency is on domestic soil, but might eventually involve overseas operations too, 6 agreed for us to have you on secondment. The importance given to the operation, especially one of the rare joint ones with the agency, underlines the great importance given to this, a status that puts it in a class of its own. Tigger thought, I'm beginning to get this now, and why it matters. There's clearly more to XR than I thought. Guess I'm lucky to be selected for this. Might turn out to be more fun than I imagined at first. So, Major, or may I now call you Luke, as that is going to be your new identity from now on, Miss Stillingfleet said. You're likely to bump into an old school chum of yours very shortly. Solo, as I think you called him at Harrow, when you two were the stars of the rugby team. Then, if I am not mistaken, later you both crossed paths again at Sandhurst. I trust I'm right in assuming you were just chums and nothing more? Tigger, or Luke as he was now to be known, grimaced and frowned. My God, yes, you have done your homework well, but just in case you have any lingering doubts, we were just normal school chums. He realized he had been played like a good 'un and risen to the bait like a novice. Especially after Stillingfleet almost cracked a smile at his reaction, or maybe it could have been something more. She was hard to work out. Nothing in his SAS training had prepared him for this type of interrogation by an attractive female, supposedly on the same team. With a smile, she said, Let's move on. I hope your interpersonal skills will improve fast enough so you do not blow your cover the first week at XR. Or when you meet Solo again. He will be warned, of course, to stick to the legend that you two have never met. The difference is that he is playing himself, and you are playing the legend of Luke, an oil drilling technician who became disenchanted with the way the oil industry conducts itself. Nothing in your background should suggest any past connections with the military. Your legend is that you spent many years around the world on oil rigs, which accounts for your introverted and somewhat antisocial demeanor. Beyond that, we will build your background in full, starting first thing tomorrow morning at our place. Here's who you ask for at reception, and please make it 9 on the dot, and dress down, casual scruffy, if you know what that means. Without waiting for a reply, she swept out of the room, leaving Tigger, or now Luke, feeling both excited and curious about what his new role had in store for him. It can't be worse than the crap I've been wasting my time on here, he mused. And how will it go with Solo? It's years since we last met. I wonder if he has changed much, and if I can rekindle the warm friendship with the big Nigerian. Back at his MI6 desk, he found Harry smiling like a Cheshire cat. What are you waiting for? Go on, clear your desk and fuck off. But the light-hearted banter was doing nothing to hide the fact that Harry thought Tigger had got the chance he had been looking for, to be allowed off the leash to romp around in a field of sheep. Harry crossed his arms and continued smiling while Luke started shoveling his few personal possessions into a cardboard box. It momentarily crossed Tigger's mind that this was the kind of box those at Lehman Brothers took home with them back in 2008 when their bank became the first major victim of the financial crisis. Now, whatever you do, old boy, don't fuck this one up, and please stay in touch. You will be meeting me at least once a month at some watering hole, so I'm in the loop. This might fall back onto our patch at some point if my instincts are right. Righty-ho. Well, so long, sir, Tigger/Luke said. He had noticed how excited Harry was, a lot more than he clearly wanted to let on. Within a couple of weeks, Tigger had been transformed into Luke and was fully operational as a volunteer dog's body at the dismal offices of the XR in East London. Tigger's biggest challenge had been to tone down his still rather plummy public school accent. It had to morph into something more South or East London suburbs, and while he had done pretty well with the speech coach at MI5, he still struggled to keep slurring his vowels once his concentration dropped. Maybe I should start dating an Essex girl. That should crack it, Luke thought. While the name Luke made him inwardly shudder, he managed to morph into his new role. The rest of his background quite easy to learn and adopt. The slightly antisocial introvert Luke was supposed to be was not a million miles from what Tigger had become anyway. His social life had not been a whole bundle of fun since the breakup with his long-term fiancée, Emma Beath, the year before. Emma was from an old Scottish family and was Rodine educated. Both families had always assumed that their long-term relationship, even formalized with an engagement ring, would have led to nuptial bliss. However, that was not to be the case, after she ran off to New York with some film producer he had never heard of. Tigger had indeed been leading a somewhat monastic existence, with few real friends in London and no real idea of how the online dating scene worked. He had in reality become introverted and, more often than not, curled up with a takeaway, watching the latest Netflix offerings rather than going out and trying to cultivate a normal social life. If truth be known, he had been feeling slightly sorry for himself on all fronts, social and work-wise. Anything that could get him out of that pattern had to be a good thing, he encouraged himself, and any misgivings soon went away as he cruised through the interview process at XR. These people are even more disorganized than I thought. They don't check a single thing I tell them about my background. They almost seem not to want to ask any personal questions at all, as if that was politically incorrect. I could have told them I was Colonel Gaddafi's shoe cleaner, and they would probably have believed it. Up there with the fairies, most of them are, Luke thought, but that head honcho plugged me with a couple of well-focused questions. What makes you think you can make a difference to XR, Luke? Should we offer you the position and give you a chance? The Irish XR Inquisitor asked. He had blagged his way through that one, and a couple more she threw at him. He later realized these were the same 3 questions she asked anyone wanting to join up and work in Shabby Town, as he liked to call the down-at-heel XR offices, where its occupants looked as if they had dressed themselves at best from a discount store like H&M. Shapeless cardigans and anoraks that even a Polish plumber would have turned his nose up at prevailed. So, luckily, Tigger had not needed to sweat through his answers and could have trotted out banal blandishments about caring for the environment and the wickedness of big business as well as most Western governments. That was when he noticed a photo of the ginger-haired POTUS pinned onto the old dartboard in the canteen, which was the target of choice over the bullseye. Being shown to his desk space in the open-plan general office that was several times worse than his previous one in the SIS building, he was told to bring in his own computer, asked to sign a non-disclosure agreement about their activities, and told what he could and could not say to third parties. He took his seat, which turned out to be a plastic chair with a second-hand school desk, and settled in with a smile to those sitting around him. None seemed particularly delighted at his presence or made much effort to introduce themselves. They were all caught up in their own small worlds, and any interruption was an unwelcome one. XR back in 2019 was more like a hippie colony than one of the world's leading climate activist movements. Still on a mission, once he had his feet under the school desk and with access to at least some of their IT networks, he could start his all-important digging. Tigger correctly assumed that the networks he was allowed access to were already well monitored by 5 and the listening services of GCHQ. So human intel that he could gather from actual or overheard real-time conversations was his primary target to start with. That meant hanging out by the coffee machine much of the time. He became a bit of an espresso addict in the end, but no one seemed to object. Others went outside for a quick smoke, and while he was not a smoker, he forced himself to join in whenever it looked as if an interesting group was forming outside. That was pretty much his routine, quickly becoming boring, along with the role he was forced to play. No nice-looking Essex girl appeared who he could date, so he contented himself with practicing his accent with the other denizens of Shabbytown. Tigger had been in situ for nearly a month when he was summoned in to see Rutherford, his handler at 5. The grey man seemed even more unremarkable than Tigger remembered. Tigger felt almost cheated that Miss Stillingfleet had not felt him worthwhile to meet in person, sending her henchman along, seemingly bereft of any sense of humour, with a deadpan expression that would have done credit to an undertaker. Only Rutherford's grey, hooded eyes reflected the presence of something human inside an otherwise hollow shell. They sat in a bleak meeting room with a small office table, 4 basic office chairs around it, and a small camera in one corner pointed straight at them. "All right if I call you Luke," Rutherford said, making himself comfortable in his chair, then carried on with, "I expect you are getting used to that by now. 2 things to cover today. First, it appears from your reports that you are getting on well with a certain Miss Crichton. Certainly she's a gift to XR, but maybe she is also a gift to us. You may or may not know that her longtime Russian oligarch boyfriend, Boris Smirnov, has been on our watch list for some years. Actually, since the day he landed in London. He keeps his nose clean, and we could not find enough reason to deny him his British passport. We suspect that a leopard doesn't change his spots, though, and he's a long-term friend of a certain Mr. Putin, even quite open about it. We are sure, knowing the way Putin works, that he will have given Smirnov certain private tasks, maybe off the radar even from their embassy. Part of your mission now is to see if you can draw him into the XR alongside Miss Crichton. The Russians can never resist some mischief, and the opportunity may be too tempting for him and his old friends to resist. Then we can get much better eyes on him and maybe find out what else he might be up to." Phew, not asking much, is he? Luke thought. The older man, who missed little, saw the incredulous expression flash across Tigger's face before he could suppress it. Rutherford followed up with, "But your main target remains the XR and its shadowy financier, the Nigerian banker Peter Amobi. He seems to live a holier-than-thou existence, even going every Sunday to the Brompton Oratory. If you don't already know, that's a famous Catholic church in London, in the swankiest part of Knightsbridge, just along from Harrods. The CIA is going apeshit that we have not managed to nail a Moby's black arse to his own cross, and now they are rolling up their sleeves, sending an undercover agent in. You know the one, Solo, but you must forget he was ever a friend of yours. He passed Luke a beige file across the table, marked Top Secret, Project Trojan. Here, I want you to look at his file. You can stay here until you have finished reading it. In a few days, we will be meeting the agency, and I'm guessing that your old school chum Solo is likely to be there. Whatever you do, try to be polite if you can manage that. Otherwise, keep stum. Remember, the Yanks always like to think they run the show. But over here, part of our job is to disabuse them of that tendency. It's getting harder and harder as they play by their own rules, even when they are on our turf. Arrogant sods if you ask me. But don't repeat that. We are supposed to be one big happy family on Project Trojan. Just don't fuck up and don't share too much either. And don't trust this Solo chap, even if he used to be one of your old school muckers, okay? With that, and a brief handshake, Rutherford left the bare meeting room, leaving Tigger to immerse himself in the Project Trojan file. What he learnt about what his old school chum had been up to in the last few years came as a bit of a shock. He was a badass now. Our reunion should be interesting, he thought. The next day was the high-level meeting between MI5, the domestic branch of the British Secret Service, and the CIA, aka the agency. It took place at the host's HQ and in a much grander meeting room than Tigger had seen before. As Tigger entered the room behind Rutherford, the visiting team was already seated, with coffees and notepads in front of them. The only one without a personal laptop was Solo. The two of them resisted the urge to run across the room and hug each other. Protocol demanded they exchange professional pleasantries, but Solo could not hold back. "Good to see you, old boy," said Solo, who had forgotten immediately that they were not supposed to recognize each other. A slight tone of mockery perhaps lay hidden under his public school accent, which he easily reverted to when times demanded, dropping any hint of an American twang he might have picked up during his college years at UCLA in California. The meeting was a bit of an anticlimax, both sides sniffing around like two semi-friendly dogs, not quite sure whether they were rivals or part of the same pack. On the agency side, the main priority was to somehow nail a Moby, who, they inferred, seemed to be protected by the British system, while he was probably funding much of the unrest in the Nigerian Delta region, along with making life difficult for the big oil companies operating there, or more specifically, those belonging to the US. For the Brits, the anarchistic XR was a thorn in their side which, if they upped their game, threatened to bring chaos and rent-a-mob unrest to British cities and beyond. Reconciling the targets took a bit of argy-bargy between the two services, but in the end, the Brits caved in as MI5 was still overwhelmed, trying to keep up with the aftermath of the 2017 Manchester bombing and thousands of potential Islamic fanatics that had a Hydra-like ability to keep growing new heads. So focused were they to that end that 90% of their resources were deployed on that ever-present deadly threat, with very little left to track other foreign miscreants. Even growing armies of commercial Chinese and Russian spies trying to steal intellectual property from sensitive industries got far less attention than they deserved. But they did not tend to blow innocent people up, and so were hardly monitored at all. After the Islamic terrorists, the next greatest threat to the nation was the fast-growing drug cartels, especially the Albanians, that had their operations in almost every major town and city across Britain. MI5 even had to beg for the loan of Tigger from MI6, its sister service that dealt with overseas intelligence and counterintelligence, as MI5 had no one spare to put undercover in the XR. What neither of the two Anglo-speaking services could predict were the events that would shortly unfold and the new actors that would suddenly take an interest in the XR. When the meeting broke up a couple of hours later, Tigger and Solo swapped mobile numbers and agreed to set up a more personal catch-up over a few beers at one of their favourite London watering holes in a couple of days, namely Polo Joe's on the Fulham Road. That was when they swapped stories from their recent past. There was a lot to talk about, and while Tigger had his share of action with the SAS, it was nothing like Solo's recent challenges back in Nigeria.